The hash-slinging slasher? Hello everyone, and welcome to day 14 of Terrorthon Slashers, a subgenre of horror which we're going to explore. It has a very rich history. What's a slasher? Well, it's a horror movie built around stalk and kill sequences with a lot of sex, blood and violence, and the events of the movie usually take place on the anniversary of some traumatic event. They often feature final girls, and slasher series tend to follow the villains of the movie instead of the heroes. But where did it all begin? Well, in the 19th century, horror plays were produced at the Grand Guignol in France, such as Maurice Tourneur's The Lunatics in 1912, which featured visceral violence. In response to these plays, in 1930 the Hays Code was established, one of the earliest censorship guidelines which restricted sex and violence. Then in 1926 a movie called The Bat came out, which was about guests in a mansion being stalked by a killer in a mask. And these inspired a whole series of old dark house movies. And then through the 1940s there were adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie stories, such as The Scarlet Claw in 1944, and then there were none in 1945, which established some common slasher tropes even back then. But then in 1960, in my opinion, the first real slasher came out, Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. This movie was actually nominated for 4 separate Academy Awards despite its violence. That same year, Michael Powell released Peeping Tom, wherein a killer murders women and photographs their dying expressions. And following suit from Psycho, Hammer Horror started releasing slashers from 1961 all the way through to 1970, including Taste of Fear in 61, Paranoiac in 63, The Nanny in 65, and Crescendo in 1970. And then splatter films came to the forefront, including the works of Herschel Gordon Lewis, such as Blood Feast in 1963, very violent and bloody movies. And then creamy films came out, which were German slashers, all throughout the late 50s and the early 70s, a really famous example being Fellowship of the Frog in 1959. And all throughout this time, Giallo movies were coming out, and a perfect example of a Giallo slasher would be Deep Red, which came out in 1975. And all throughout the 70s, exploitation movies were coming out, such as Wes Craven's Last House on the Left in 1972, which was probably the most violent movie of all time at that point. And we also had, of course, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, a very famous one. And that same year, Black Christmas came out, which was a precursor to one of the most famous slashers of all time, Halloween, which came out in 1978. Interestingly, while Jamie Lee Curtis starred in Halloween, her mother Janet Leigh starred in Psycho all those years prior, so I think we have a slasher family on our hands there. And this signalled the beginning of the golden age of slashers as it's come to be known, which ran from 1978 till 1984, and the whole sex equals death precedent set by Halloween was copied all throughout this era. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected, and this introduced a whole new age of conservatism and rising concerns about rising violence in movies. And yet, that same year, Friday the 13th was born. Jason Voorhees endures as an icon to this day, so that kind of says it all. By 1981 though, the market was oversaturated with slashers, and My Bloody Valentine completely flopped after being heavily edited. But then it was revitalised again in 1984 with Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven has had a lot of influence on the slasher genre, and this signalled the silver age of slashers from 1985 to 1995. By this time the public really were suffering from slasher fatigue, and many of them were released direct to video, they didn't even make it to the theatres. But inspired by Freddy Krueger and his incredible personality, we got Child's Play in 1988, and then the previously discussed Candyman in 1992. And all throughout this time we were getting sequels to Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, all of them. This is a problem to this day with horror franchises being milked to death, as I'm sure you're aware. And this began the Bronze Age of slashers, which ran from 1996 all the way through to the present day. Late 90s slashers were generally pretty terrible, but there were some exceptions, such as Scream in 1996, which inspired a whole slew of sequels as well. We had I Know What You Did Last Summer in 1997, and a whole bunch of crap which doesn't bear mentioning. And then we started to get a lot of horror movie remakes, starting in the early 2000s all the way through to the present day. I'm also sick of that, as I'm sure you are too, these rancid remakes, truly rancid. And then the torture porn subgenre was born in the mid-2000s with the likes of Saw and Hostel. That's a very extreme version of a slasher right there. And then The Purge in 2013 was actually quite a popular slasher, and that also, as always, inspired a whole bunch of sequels. And that brings us all the way to the present day. Scream 5 came out this January, and Halloween Ends comes out this month. Whew, that was a lot to take in, huh? And the thing is, guys, I only scratched the surface. I had no idea the slasher history was so rich, and I highly recommend looking into it more if you're interested. See you tomorrow.